Welcome back. Impressionism, the second part. So this will be our group of artists who kind of coalesce around the style of Degas. So although they showed with the other group that we've already looked at, these artists tend to have a little bit more of a clear, more detailed, little crisper, little tighter drawing and painting style. So the two biggest stars of this movement truly are Degas and Mary Cassatt. We're also going to look at Whistler, and you may remember Whistler from the painting most often called Whistler's Mother. So you can see right off the bat when we look at the work of Caillebotte, you see here that the detail in this painting is much, much greater. It almost feels more like a realist painting from a little bit earlier in the century than what we saw in the previous lecture. But remember that Caillebotte was friends with Renoir. In fact, he was in the painting of the boating party. So he is definitely a member of the group, and what really sets him apart, I think, as a member of the Impressionists is that he's giving us a sense of Paris life. It's not just leisure, it's not out in nature, it's here on the city streets. And he paints with a real sense of integrity, with these unique points of view and very interesting use of perspective as well. It feels like you're kind of in the scene, you're really right there with them. The work of Degas is probably the most influential in this second lecture on Impressionism. He is someone who was not necessarily born to be an artist. He initially was studying law, believe it or not. He also has a connection to America, and we'll look at his trip to his family in Louisiana as well. He's another one of the artists in the Impressionist group who also had trouble with his eyesight, as did Mary Cassatt. So you might wonder, if you look at some of the later work, starts to be a little out of focus. It's almost logical to think that not only are these artists reacting because of the existence of the camera, they no longer have to make things that look 100% realistic because the camera can do that. They can concentrate on color instead of detail, but also because their own vision might become blurry, as with Monet's cataracts or Degas' vision problems or Cassatt's. It may explain a little bit why they were attracted to these softer kinds of styles. This is a portrait that Degas did of Manet. Remember, he was still very much their hero. He, through the Salon des Refusés in 1863, the exhibition of Le Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, really kind of set this movement going. So they very much revered him. But this is a little bit closer to what Degas is better known for. This painting is known as the Glass of Absinthe. And absinthe is, as you probably know, an alcoholic beverage, but one that also acts like a hallucinogenic drug. It is usually sort of greenish. You can see that there's a greenish cast to the glass in front of this young woman, who does not appear to be absolutely thrilled, does she? She is perhaps under the influence already of the effect of the drug. She may be hallucinating. What she looks like to us is very different from whatever visions she may be experiencing herself. But it gives Degas a chance to kind of criticize this culture a little bit. It gives us a sense of what the negative effect of this kind of use of this alcohol might have on a person. So it's a rather unusual composition, which is kind of typical for Degas. We're located in an odd position. We're seated at a table near her, but it still feels as though we're at a fairly high vantage point, looking a bit downward on the subject. Although she's in the center of the composition, more or less, she's shifted a bit more to the right, and with her companion there, they kind of start to lean over to the right-hand side of the frame. So there's a fair amount of negative space. If you look at the floor in front of their feet, even the table where we're sitting become kind of large blank spaces. So there's also, again, an influence here of the Japanese style in printmaking in particular, because Japanese prints were now available for collection in the West. A lot of the artists in this group, especially the Degas group, began to be influenced by those compositional devices really coming from Japan. You can still see some loose brushstroke going on here. It's certainly not as tight as something that would have been done by a neoclassical artist, certainly, or even by a realist like Courbet or Rosa Bonheur. The models in these cases, or in this case rather, are friends of Degas. So he's actually hired an actress to kind of play this character, which is a little unusual as well. This is a bit more typical of some of the subjects that Degas is best known for. He did like kind of manly things like horse racing, but again, here you see there's an odd amount of negative space in the foreground at the left-hand side. That's a lot of grass before we get to those horses and jockeys. So you see he always has kind of an unusual point of view, but he does like to show us entertainment. He likes to show us cafes, sporting events, but the subject he's probably most associated with, of course, is the ballet. And there are literally dozens of images I could show you of ballerinas behind the scenes, from the back of the stage, painted from the house. And they all seem to kind of float in a little bit of an unreal space because he's concentrating so much on the effect of movement of light across those surfaces. The tutus that the ballerinas are wearing are almost the perfect garment for an impressionist to paint because they're so diaphanous. They don't have as much surface detail as they have a bit of shape and a lot of movement. Some of my personal favorites are his pastel drawings. They're often done on paper. These are actually on cardboard. And so he is investigating a subject we've seen before. We certainly have seen plenty of female nudes, but these are not goddesses, and they're not necessarily in a public space. These feel more intimate, a little bit more private, but we're still looking down in on them from a slightly higher vantage point, which is a little bit more Japanese. These are some works from Degas' time in America, believe it or not. He actually had family who lived in New Orleans, and they were involved in the cotton exchange. In fact, the painting that you're seeing there is known as the cotton exchange. What you're looking at ultimately are images that he's trying to show what the real world is like in this, to him, perhaps slightly exotic location. The portrait at the bottom there, on the bottom left, is a portrait of his cousin, the wife of Rene, who was actually blind in one eye herself, and Degas himself had retinopathy, which began to limit his eyesight in one eye, and so he began to have to work indoors really fairly young. He was only about 36 when it began to take its toll. So the softness of some of the images perhaps can be explained by some of the physicality of what's happening to his eyes. For an artist who depends on painting the real world the way it really looks to them, their eyesight was a major aspect of their careers. Mary Cassatt, I can't say enough about. She is an American expatriate. If you remember your vocab term, an expatriate is not somebody who hates America. An expat is someone who is living overseas but is still an American citizen. Now, Mary Cassatt was from a wealthy family, so she had certainly some advantages in that regard that allowed her to have this kind of life. However, as a woman, she was still pretty much under the control of her father when it came to her finances, and he was rather stern with her about supporting this odd bohemian life that she wanted to lead as an artist overseas. So he insisted that she share her ledgers, her financial records with him, and if she couldn't prove that she was turning a profit, then he was going to cut off the purse strings. So fortunately for all of us, Mary Cassatt did manage to make a success of things. She also was instrumental in supporting other artists within the Impressionist group. She paid for exhibition spaces. If she was the major supplier of finances for an exhibition, even if she was included herself in the show, she refused to have her name on the posters. So yes, she was definitely helping people because of family money, but she was doing it in an incredibly generous and supportive way. On occasion, she even purchased artwork from the male artists in order to not just give them a handout, own a piece of their work, to pay them for their work so that they could then support themselves. She also had cataracts and became almost blind fairly young, so you're also seeing a bit of softness in her work perhaps from that. aspect of her personal health. What you're seeing here, though, is a portrait of her sister, and she's in a public space. They're in their theater box or opera box. But what you're seeing is a little deceptive. There's actually a mirror behind her, which is reflecting the other people in the balconies across from them. She is actually looking out at the stage, although it's a little hard to see that. Here is the Cassatt piece to know. This is a fairly typical subject for her, sometimes criticized for being a very female-driven subject, but we know that what she was doing more often than not was painting the real world the way she saw it. Of course she painted female subjects. It's an interesting composition, though, don't you think? It feels as if we're looking down on her from a higher vantage point, just like with Degas. We don't see much of the wall, we don't see a window, we don't see the ceiling, but we see a lot of the floor. She's very interested in texture and pattern, as you can tell from this, and in this intimate relationship of these two figures, mother and daughter. We know, though, from her records that she would sometimes hire models who were in fact not related to one another at all, but who looked right for her purposes. So she was clearly influenced by Japanese prints. And in point of fact, these are some examples of dry points that she made, that the color is done etching process known as aquatint. There is a full collection of these prints owned by the Cameron Art Museum in Wilmington. We're one of the few museums in the entire world that have the full set of Cassatt's dry points with aquatint. A dry point is relatively easy to do in a way. It's a pretty direct process. You take a metal plate, usually copper, scratch into it with a sharp needle, and that raises up a little bit of metal to the side of where you're scratching, known as the burr, and that holds the ink, and it gives it a little bit of a softer, more pen-like appearance. The coloration that you see there is achieved by an etching process known as aquatint, which is a little more complicated, but essentially the plate is etched in a successive number of times, and the more that it's exposed to the acid, the darker and deeper those areas become, allowing for more ink. So you can get almost a watercolor effect from this process. So these prints are very, very much influenced by Japanese design. You can kind of see the same pattern here, and even probably the same water picture from the painting we just looked at. These images are very heavily influenced by the prints that were being collected that were coming from Japan now that it was open to trade with the West. So we know that Cassatt, in fact, tried to get Degas and other members of the group to start supplementing their income by producing series of images in print form. By printing them on paper, they would be faster to produce. They could mass produce the same image multiple times for sale. It would be a way of selling a piece that would be less costly to the collector as well. And she really thought it was a way that they could sustain themselves as artists. Unfortunately, a lot of the other members of the Impressionist group did not follow her advice. This is the work of James Abbott McNeill Whistler, another artist living abroad. He actually ends up living in England. And so Whistler's Mother is a painting that you might know. You might not recognize this. It's a very obviously impressionistic image of the water of the Thames River. And you can see a particular kind of style of long, low boat that was used on the Thames as sort of a long streak of paint there toward the foreground on the land side toward the center. But you get the reflection of light in the water very much like what we saw with Monet. These paintings, though, did actually cause a bit of a scandal. Here's the piece that we need to know for the test that really caused a scandal in the art world. This is Whistler's Nocturne in black and gold, subtitled Falling Rocket. So the image here is of fireworks over the river, over the water, and you can see the reflection of the light. You can see the sparks as the fireworks explode and then the sparks drop. You can see the smoke from the explosions. To me, this looks very much like an impressionistic image of what it looks like to see fireworks being shot off over water. When it was exhibited, however, the most powerful art critic of the day, John Ruskin, criticized this painting. He absolutely tore Whistler apart in his commentary about how terrible this work was. So let's delve into that a little bit. John Ruskin, using some relatively obscure terminology. Remember, of course, these are words from the 1800s. I'll translate it into 21st century emoji speak a little bit. John Ruskin refers to Whistler as having the ill-educated conceit, the aspect of willful imposture. I've seen and heard much of cockney impudence, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Well, ill-educated indicates that the artist is untrained. That he calls him cockney indicates that he's a lower class. The British, of course, are known for their class system, and the Cockney style of speech sounds a bit like this, mate. It's not a cultured way of speaking. It implies low class, poorly educated. So he's slim a couple times now about this not being good, not being smart, not being trained. Being impudent and having willful imposture really means that he's out of his lane. He is jumped up, we might say, in America. He's out of his place. He thinks he's all that. So John Ruskin's trying to really tell us that Whistler is a con artist and a not terribly well-educated one. Coxcomb is a pretty low term here. If you think about what a rooster looks like, the comb is the red floppy thing on his head, and roosters move their heads around a lot. So if you imagine somebody moving their head about and having this floppy hat on top, it implies that they're flighty, they're dumb. It implies they're a little bit effeminate as well. He's asking 200 guineas. Now, guinea is a unit of currency. So he's criticizing here the price, the price tag that's on this painting in exhibition. And he says in the end here that all he's done, what he's asking you to give up 200 guineas in order to own, is a painting where he did nothing but just kind of fling a pot of paint in your face. He didn't really do anything. Well, you know the difference between criticism and slander or libel. Slander is verbally saying something that is intended to destroy someone's reputation. Libel is printing it, and that's what Ruskin did. He was the most influential published art critic of his day, and he published this review of Whistler's work, and Whistler sued him for libel. And in fact, he won the case. It cost him load of money to be able to win the case, and he didn't win a huge amount of damage. But what happened in the case was at least a moral victory. One of the more interesting things about the issue here is to think about what the value of work is. So in 01, I played around with some monetary figures here. So a guinea, for whatever reason, was worth £1 plus 1 shilling. So if you round it up to the year 2001, what we're looking at is roughly the equivalent of asking about $14,000, $14,500 for that painting, which is like a lot, right? But that's less than a decent new car. It's less than a decent used car nowadays. And it's certainly not a number that you could support yourself and a family on if that was the only sale you made, if that was the only money that you had coming in as income for an entire year. You'd need multiple sales at that rate to be able to support yourself. So he's not asking for $1 billion. He's asking for fair amount. Now, one of the questions he was asked by the judge in the trial, Mr. Whistler, how long did it take you to do that? Because, of course, the longer that a piece takes, the more effort, the more work, right, the better it is. I certainly have made paintings that I spent a lot of time on that were terrible, and I've had some that I did quickly that were much better. So I'm not sure that the argument really holds, but Whistler's answer was brilliant. He said to the judge, "Sir, it took me my entire life to learn to paint in this style." So that kind of put that argument to rest. So Whistler definitely is an intriguing person. When you think about what he's doing, it is a little confrontational, and it is a little bit intense, I think, in terms of the effect that it has. The reason there's a white box there on your screen is I wanted to show you what real pure white looks like in comparison to all the different types of white that are in that painting, in her dress, the drape behind her, the white fur of the fur rug. You could argue even her skin is really pale. The gloves are a pale white, but none of it is pure white straight out of the tube. There's yellowish, gray, blue-ish in all of those different areas. So you can see what he's doing is making his painting a portrait, arguably, but notice that the title is Symphony in White. It's not the girl's name, it's the exploration of that color. And he does the same thing when he paints his own mother. When he's painting his mother, the painting is not called Whistler's Mother. The title is actually Arrangement in Gray and Black #1. And believe it or not, there's even a gray and black #2. He's using people almost as props to explore composition, color, and value, which really is a rather impressionist idea, a rather modern painting idea. My favorite story about Whistler in some ways comes from this image right here. If you look at the top right, you're looking at a very, very green room with some gold embellishments, but over the fireplace, there's a painting in a frame, and that painting had been purchased for Frederick Richards. This Frederick Richards Leyland. Frederick Richards Leyland was a millionaire who had bought one of Whistler's paintings that was titled The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, another obsession with this kind of Japanese style. And she's surrounded by vases that are primarily in blue and white, and that was what Leyland was collecting. You can see that in the lower image on the lower left-hand side. You can see some of the vases that he would have had in this room. He had actually hired an interior designer to design this space where this painting was going to be hung, and the designer had lined the walls with red or dark burgundy leather, believe it or not, almost like wallpaper made of leather. And then they hung the painting, and when Whistler was asked to come see it, he pitched a fit because he thought the reddish color was not right for his painting. So he actually tricked the interior designer to get out of the room, locked himself in it, and redecorated the whole place. And then, remember, he was not asked to do this. Leyland is off on a business trip. He actually submitted a bill to Mr. Leyland for his services. That's what you see at the bottom right. Those two peacocks are fighting over some coins. At the right-hand peacock's feet are some silver coins on the ground. The Leyland, of course, did not want to pay for this. He ruined all this beautiful red leather. Believe it or not, this entire room was taken apart and reassembled. It's now part of one of the Smithsonian Museum collections in Washington, D.C. You can actually go stand inside of it. It exists in the real world. This is the painting. Whether it would have looked bad against red is a little bit debatable at this point, but kind of a funny story about artists and their integrity.